Daryl for that lovely anthem, as well as my thanks on everyone's behalf go to the musicians who have also joined us today, our trumpeter and our piper, as well as to the Legion and to the 10th Barrie Scouts for sending delegates, representatives, to help make the day a special one. We really enjoyed some nice weather days this past week, didn't we? It was very unseasonably warm and bright and sunny for November in this part of the world. And I hope that you were able in some small way to get out and enjoy some fresh air and some sunshine. I took advantage of the nice days by getting my bike out of the garage and going for a couple of rides. I did not expect to be able to ride outdoors again this year, and lo and behold, I was able to enjoy a couple of nice rides. Now, I have a road bike, one of the bikes with the thin tires and the curly handlebars, and I've had that bike for about 5 years. And every time I go for a ride, I remember my friend Vern, who taught me some of the tricks of the trade when it comes to road biking. Of course, I knew how to ride a bike, but there are a few things to riding a road bike which you might not understand just from watching it at a distance. My friend Vern gave me some training tips on how to improve one's endurance, the ability to go a long way. He taught me a few little tips about how to make the bike go a little bit faster. Most of all, he told me some things that I can do to avoid crashing. There are gravel on the road to watch out for, and ways to be aware of other riders, and safer ways to get on and off the bike, especially in a crowd. And because of Vern's sage advice, I'm happy to say that in 5 years of riding the bike, I've only had one crash. And I did it because I found myself in a situation that Vern hadn't prepared me for. And so I did something kind of foolish in hindsight, and I won't do it again, and hopefully I won't have any more crashes. No one riding a bike wants to be standing on the side of the road with a broken arm or anything like that. Now, I'm not here to give you a lesson about how to ride a road bike, but to raise a more philosophical question which can apply to all the different areas of our lives. And that is this: will we be wise enough to learn from others' mistakes, or will we be foolish and insist on making those mistakes for ourselves? Our scripture reading this morning came from the book of Judges. The book of Judges tells the story of ancient Israel in the period after they had finished their wilderness wandering and gone into the promised land, but before they were really the rulers of that land, and before they were an established nation or kingdom. They were really a group of tribes who had lived in the promised land alongside and in constant tension with other groups of peoples, the Philistines in particular. And the tribal rulers of these ancient Hebrew tribes living in that land were known as judges. One of the judges was Samson. He was reputedly the strongest man in the world. He fought against the Philistines and won many great victories for the Hebrews. And yet Samson also did many wicked things, and he was particularly infamous for consorting, shall we say, with Philistine women. Now, as I began to read and study in preparation for today's worship, I started off by questioning the inclusion of this particular episode in our congregational curriculum known as the story, which is taking 31 weeks to run through the narrative high points of Scripture. I wondered why on earth did they think this was important enough to include. In moments of despair, I wondered even why the writers of Scripture in antiquity would deem it worthy to include the story of such a shady character in the Scriptures. If you read through the whole life of Samson, which is told from chapter 13 to 16 in the book of Judges, you find someone who is about as morally inspiring as O.J. Simpson. Why would we talk about him on a Sunday? Well, as I read and studied and reflected further, it occurs to me that the life of Samson is really intended to be a kind of ancient tragedy. An ancient tragedy. The Greeks started writing tragedy in the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago. And in their tragedies, they told stories of people who started off life in a very high estate. And through various situations and consequences of bad decisions, their lives went off the rails in terrible ways. This is what we find in the story of Samson. At the beginning of his life, we hear that his parents had been unable to conceive. His mother was barren in the language of the Scriptures. And like so many barren women in the Old Testament, she prayed to God and said, God, if only you will give me a son, I will dedicate his entire life to you. God answered her prayer, and she was able to conceive. And Samson was born, and he had great strength. Not only had God given her a child, but God had given her a child who would be a great leader for God's people, Israel. And indeed, Samson won many great victories for the Hebrews. And we find Samson also did things which were wicked and evil. He did great harm, which was unnecessary. And his lust led his life to be completely out of control. And through various circumstances, his life went off the rails. His love for Delilah was such that he would give away the secret of his strength that God had given to him. And he allowed himself to be captured by the Philistines, who reportedly poked out his eyes and enslaved him. At the end of Samson's story, we did not hear it read, but perhaps you remember it from former times, and he's in absolute misery, and he's chained up, and the best thing he can do is ask God to give him one last moment of strength so that he can push down the walls of the building that he's in, killing himself and the Philistines who were there with him. It is a real tragedy. Someone whose life and whose strength was a very gift of God. Someone whose life went off the rails and ended in tragedy. Sadly, there are tragedies which occur not only in literature, but which occur in real life. Just the other day, I was watching a documentary program on CNN, and it was about these great big outdoor electronic music festivals. And it was a portrayal of the culture of the mostly young people who go and dance all weekend to these very heavy electronic beats. And one of the big parts of that particular culture is for people to take these synthetic drugs. The most popular one is known as ecstasy. And there was a story of this particular young woman who had a wonderful future in front of her. She was an honor student at the University of Virginia. She was on the tennis team. She was bright. She was popular. She had everything going for her and so much to look forward to. So one night she was out at a nightclub with some friends in Washington, D.C. area, and she took one of these ecstasy pills which had been mixed with some other kind of dangerous chemical, and she died. Just like that. One foolish decision and a life of promise snuffed out. What kind of a sense can we possibly make of such a terrible story? Well, I think there's only one way to make sense of it, and that is that the young woman's parents, who are still alive, spend most of their waking hours in various kinds of efforts to educate the public, to educate young people, to educate lawmakers about the dangers of these kinds of activities, and telling their daughter's story, so that hopefully others will learn from this tragedy and it will not be repeated unnecessarily in the future. Learning from tragedy is the only way that we can make sense of it. Today is Remembrance Sunday, and we remember with a great sense of somberness the loss of life in the world wars and in other conflicts in the last century in which our country and others have taken part. And I think there is not much we can say about war except that it is a human tragedy. And we must remember it so that we can learn from it. I think this sense of learning is why tragedy remains an enduring type of storytelling in our civilization. I think it's because by telling the stories of tragedies, there is some hope that we might learn from mistakes and yet not have the dreadful suffering of real people. There's a British playwright who once said that after the musical, you're anybody's fool, but you emerge from tragedy equipped against lies. The stories of a tragedy are those from which we are meant to learn. I think this is how we are to read the story of Samson in the context of the Scriptures. You see, the Hebrew people believed in something they called wisdom. Wisdom is that belief that God has created the universe in such a way that there are things we can learn just by a careful observation of the world around us. There are many things we need to know and to do in life which do not require a special message from God. The sense of wisdom and folly, rather, is woven into the universe, deliberately put there by God to teach us ways of living and the difference between right and wrong. I began my reflection on the story of Samson, truly lamenting its place in Scripture. And I have come actually to a place of great admiration for these Hebrew people who had discovered the wisdom of tragedy centuries even before the Greeks. For they recognized the wisdom of God that comes from learning about the mistakes of others. The question for us remains: will we be wise enough to learn from the mistakes of others? Or will we insist on making those same mistakes ourselves? I think it is true that we cannot learn entirely from others. We must live our own lives. We must have our own experiences. We must surely make some mistakes ourselves. Goodness knows, as a teenager, I have certainly made my share. But if we want to avoid tragedy. If we want to ensure that our lives do not go completely off the rails, that people do not look at us and simply shake their heads in sorrow about the tragedy that our lives have become, we must learn from the mistakes of others. Because, friends, all of us are at many points in our lives standing at the precipice. And there is a very thin line separating success from failure, separating wisdom from folly. And so we look at those whose lives are tragedy, not with condemnation, but with a sense of sober awareness, realizing the reality of our situation and giving thanks to God. For in wisdom we learn to say, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Amen.